wind off the River Aldwyn cut through Eleanor Hart's shawl like a blade made of ice, and still she walked faster, because staying still tonight felt more dangerous than the cold. Behind her, back in the narrow lane where her print shop stood with its dark windows and its silent press, a man named Walter Grimsby had left a paper nailed to her door only hours before. She had read it twice by candlelight, her hands shaking, though her face had stayed calm. The paper said her shop would be seized within the week, unless she paid a debt that had never truly been hers to pay. It had been her husband's debt, incurred before his death, and now it belonged to her, the way a shadow belongs to whoever is unlucky enough to be standing in the light. She had not cried. Eleanor had promised herself, the night Henry Hart died, that she would not cry in front of anyone again, and she had kept that promise so strictly that she sometimes forgot to allow herself the release, even when alone. Instead, when the walls of her small house grew too tight around her thoughts, she came here, to the river path, where the water moved and the world felt larger than her troubles. Tonight the path was empty. The moon hung low and orange behind a curtain of thin cloud, casting just enough light to silver the reeds and turn the river into a long ribbon of moving glass. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter and walked past the old boathouse, past the crooked willow that had grown sideways since before she was born, her mind turning over numbers she could not make add up no matter how many times she tried. She did not notice the first sign of anything wrong until her foot nearly slid on the wet stone at the water's edge. She caught herself against the trunk of the willow, breath catching, heart hammering from the near fall, and it was only then, steadying herself, that she saw the shape caught in the reeds a few feet downstream. At first her mind offered her comfortable explanations. Sack of grain, fallen from a boat. A bundle of cloth someone had thrown away. But sacks did not have the pale curve of a hand, fingers half curled, breaking the surface of the black water. Eleanor's breath left her in a rush. She should have turned and run for the constable. She knew that even as she was already moving toward the water, her boots slipping on the muddy bank, her skirts soaking through in an instant, as she waded in without a single thought for how cold the river was in early spring. Later she would not be able to explain why she had not gone for help first. She would only be able to say that some part of her, some old and stubborn part that had buried a husband and kept a business alive through sheer will, refused to let a person die in the water while she stood on dry land, debating what was proper. The current tugged at her legs as she reached the shape and closed her hands around an arm that was far too still. She pulled, and the body did not come easily. It was heavy, in the way that only a person entirely without strength of their own could be heavy. And for one terrible moment she thought she had waded into the river for nothing, that whoever this was had already gone somewhere she could not follow. Then, as she dragged him toward the bank, his head lolled back, and the moonlight caught his face, and Eleanor forgot the cold, forgot the ache in her arms, forgot even the paper nailed to her door. He looked young, though not so young as to be a boy, his jaw shadowed with several days of unshaven growth, his dark hair plastered flat against his forehead. There was a mark along his temple that would become a bruise by morning if he lived long enough to grow one, and his lip was split, though the swelling had gone down enough to suggest it had happened some time ago, not tonight. His clothes, even soaked through and torn at one shoulder, were finer than anything she had touched since she sold the last of her husband's good coats to pay for coal. The fabric was a deep gray that even wet held its weave, and beneath the tear, she caught the gleam of a shirt too white and too fine for a bargeman or a farmhand. She pressed 2 fingers to his throat, the way she had once seen a physician do for her husband, and for a long moment she felt nothing, and her own heart seemed to stop in sympathy. Then, faint as a moth's wing against glass, she found it. A pulse, slow, but there. "You are not allowed to die on my riverbank," she said aloud, to no one, her voice fierce with something that surprised her. "Not tonight. I have had quite enough tonight." She hauled him further onto the bank, out of reach of the water, and knelt over him in the mud, trying to think clearly, despite the cold soaking into her bones. There was a strange, sweetish smell about him beneath the river water, something she could not place at first, and then did. It reminded her faintly of the tincture the apothecary had given Henry in his last month, the drops that made him sleep so heavily he barely woke to eat. Laudanum, or something like it. Far too much of it, if the smell clinging to his skin was any guide. That, more than the bruise, more than the torn shoulder of his coat, made her go still with a new kind of fear. A man did not end up half drowned in a river reeking of a sleeping draft by accident. Someone had done this to him. Someone had wanted him gone, and quietly. Eleanor looked up and down the empty path, suddenly aware of how alone she was, how far the nearest house stood, how easily the same hands that had left this stranger in the water might still be near enough to see her kneeling over him. The reasonable thing, the safe thing, would be to go for the constable and let this become someone else's problem, a matter for men with badges and official questions. But if she left him here to fetch help, he might slip back into the water, or simply stop breathing in the cold before anyone returned. And if whoever had hurt him learned that he had been found alive, that he had been seen by a witness, they might come back to finish what they had started. And Eleanor did not like the idea of a stranger's blood, or her own, spilled because she had been too cautious to act. She had spent 3 years since Henry's death making decisions alone, with no husband to consult, and no family close enough to help. She had learned, in that time, to trust the part of herself that moved, before fear had a chance to argue. "Right," she muttered, mostly to steady her own nerves. "Right. Up you get, whoever you are." He did not get up, of course. He could not. But talking to him, even though he could not hear her, made the task in front of her feel smaller. She worked her arms under his shoulders, grateful for years of hauling reams of paper and heavy trays of type at the press, and began to drag him away from the water, toward the path, one slow step at a time. He was tall, taller than Henry had been, and his weight nearly buckled her knees more than once, but she did not stop, because stopping meant thinking about how impossible the task was, and thinking was a luxury she could not afford just then. By the time she reached the low wooden gate that marked the start of the lane behind her shop, her arms burned, and her breath came in ragged gasps that fogged in the cold air. She paused there, chest heaving, and looked at the dark shape of her house ahead, its windows blank and unlit, the printing shop beside it silent as a held breath. Bringing an injured stranger into her home was, by any measure a sensible woman would apply, a foolish and possibly dangerous thing to do. She did not know his name. She did not know who wanted him dead, or why, or whether that person might come looking for him along this very lane. But she also knew what happened to people who were found insensible in market towns like this one. If she left him for the parish to find, he would be carried to whatever cold room served the poor and friendless, and if he was lucky enough to survive there, he would wake to strangers who owed him nothing and might ask more questions than protection. She thought, briefly and without wanting to, of Henry, and of how frightened he had been in his last days, and how much it had mattered to her that he was not frightened alone. "Come on then," she said to the unconscious man, adjusting her grip. Not much further. It took her nearly a quarter of an hour to get him through the back gate, across the small yard where she grew mint and onions in warmer months, and through the low door into her kitchen, where the banked fire still gave off a weak orange glow. She laid him down on the rag rug before the hearth, breathing hard, and knelt beside him to catch her breath, before allowing herself to truly look at what she had brought into her home. In the firelight, his face looked less like a stranger pulled from a river, and more like something out of one of the printed romances she sometimes set in type for the shop's better-paying customers, tales of lost lords and secret identities that she had always privately thought a little foolish. There was a stillness to his features, even slack with unconsciousness, that spoke of a life spent being looked at rather than doing the looking, a face unused to hardship written into every line of it, despite the bruises now marking it. She noticed, as she peeled back the torn shoulder of his coat to check for wounds beneath, that his undershirt, though soaked and stained, was stitched with a neatness and fineness of thread that no ordinary tailor in Millbrook would have produced, and on the smallest finger of his left hand, half hidden beneath the cuff of his sleeve, she caught the dull gleam of a ring, gold, set with a dark stone, engraved with some mark she could not make out in the low light. A gentleman, then, or something like one. Eleanor sat back on her heels, suddenly uneasy in a new way. A gentleman half drowned and drugged did not simply wash up by accident. Someone with money, someone with a name worth protecting, had tried to make this man disappear, and had very nearly succeeded. Whatever she had pulled out of that river, it was far larger a thing than she had first understood, and there was no way, kneeling there in her kitchen with the fire dying and a stranger's blood drying on his temple, for her to know just how much larger it would become. She reached for a clean cloth, wetted in the basin by the hearth, and began, very gently, to clean the wound at his temple, because whatever else was true, whoever he was and whatever trouble had followed him into the water, he was, for tonight at least, only a hurt man who needed help, and Eleanor Hart had never in her life been able to walk past that. Outside, the wind picked up along the empty river path, rattling the bare branches of the crooked willow, and somewhere beyond the edge of town, in a place Eleanor could not yet imagine, a man in a fine carriage was already asking a quiet question about whether the job by the river had been finished properly, and receiving an answer that would, in time, bring him back to Millbrook to make certain of it himself. For now, though, none of that had reached her door. For now there was only the fire, the rug, the stranger's slow and shallow breathing, and the small, fierce decision Eleanor had made without quite meaning to make it, that whoever this man was, she was not going to let him die. She worked through the night by firelight, cleaning the wound, checking his breathing, laying blankets over him where he lay, because she did not trust herself to lift him again onto her own narrow bed. Twice he stirred and murmured words she could not make sense of, fragments that sounded like names, like warnings, like a man arguing with someone who was not there. Each time, she pressed a cool cloth to his brow and told him, quietly, that he was safe, though in truth, she had no way of knowing whether that was true, for him or for herself. Dawn was still hours away when exhaustion finally caught up with her, and she fell asleep sitting upright in the chair beside him, one hand resting near his on the rug, as if some part of her, even in sleep, wanted to be certain he was still breathing. She did not know, as the fire burned low and the town outside slept on unaware, that the man on her hearthrug carried a name spoken with reverence and fear, in halls far grander than her own, or that his absence had already set in motion a search that would reach into every corner of the county, or that when he finally opened his eyes, the first thing he would do was lie to her about who he was. All she knew, in that quiet hour before dawn, was that she had done the only thing her conscience would allow, and that whatever came of it, she would face it the way she had faced everything since Henry died, alone, afraid, and entirely unwilling to give up. He woke to the smell of wood smoke and something sharp and clean, like herbs steeped in hot water, and for a long moment he could not remember his own name. That frightened him more than the pain did, and the pain was considerable. His skull throbbed with every heartbeat, a slow, grinding ache behind his eyes, and his mouth tasted of copper and something bitter that made his stomach turn. He kept his eyes closed, listening, the way he had once been taught to do by an old huntsman on his family's land, back when he was a boy who thought danger was only ever a game played in the woods behind the house. There was a fire nearby. He could hear it settling, the soft collapse of a log breaking into embers. There was also breathing, slow and even, close enough that he understood, before he opened his eyes, that he was not alone. He remembered the water. He remembered cold that felt like it had teeth, and before that, hands that were not gentle, and a cup pressed to his lips that he had been too weak to refuse, and a voice, low and satisfied, saying something about how much simpler this would make things for everyone. He remembered the panic of realizing his own limbs would not obey him, that his tongue had gone thick and slow, that the world had begun to tilt and spin even though he had not moved. After that, nothing, until the smell of wood smoke. He opened his eyes slowly, bracing for pain against the light, but the room was dim, lit only by a low fire, and a single candle burned down, almost to its dish. He lay on a rug before a small hearth, in a kitchen that was neat despite its plainness, shelves of jars and dried herbs along one wall, a heavy wooden table scarred with years of use, and in a chair pulled close beside him, a woman asleep sitting upright, her head tipped uncomfortably to one side, dark hair coming loose from its pins, one hand resting near his own on the rug, as though she had meant to keep watch, and lost the battle with exhaustion sometime before dawn. He did not know her. He was certain of that much, even through the fog in his mind. He had never in his life seen this woman, this room, this modest home, with its smell of ink beneath the wood smoke, faint, but unmistakable to a man who had spent enough time in libraries and offices to know the scent of a printing press. Panic rose in him, quick and cold, before reason could catch up. He did not know where he was. He did not know who this woman was, or what she wanted, or whether she was part of what had been done to him, or simply someone unlucky enough to have found him. His first instinct, born of a lifetime of being taught that trust was a luxury, afforded only to those who could afford to be wrong, was to get up, to leave, to put distance between himself and anyone who might know something about him that he did not yet understand himself. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. The room tilted violently, and a wave of nausea rolled through him so strong that he had to press a hand flat against the floor to keep from falling sideways. A small, strangled sound escaped him before he could stop it. The woman woke instantly, the way people do when they have trained themselves to wake at the smallest sound, her eyes snapping open and finding him at once. For a moment neither of them moved, him half risen and swaying, her still seated, but every line of her body gone tense and alert. "You should not be sitting up," she said, and her voice was low, steady, the kind of voice that expected to be listened to. "You are still weak, and you have a wound at your temple that I have only just managed to close. Lie back down before you undo my work." He did not lie back down. He stayed where he was, one hand braced on the floor, studying her in the low firelight, trying to decide, through the fog of pain, whether she was a threat. She did not look like one. She looked tired, in a deep, worn way that had nothing to do with a single sleepless night, and her clothes, though clean and carefully mended, were the clothes of a woman who counted every coin twice before spending it. Her hands, when she reached toward him, were rough at the knuckles, in the way of someone who worked with them daily, and there was ink, he noticed now, faintly staining the side of one finger, the mark of a trade rather than an accident. "Who are you?" he managed, and his own voice sounded strange to him, rasping and unfamiliar, as though he had not used it in days. "Where is this?" "You are in my kitchen," she said, "in Millbrook, and you are here because I pulled you half drowned out of the river last night, and because I did not much fancy leaving you to die on the bank, while I went to fetch someone else to decide what to do about you. My name is Eleanor Hart. I would very much like to know yours." He said nothing. The question sat in the space between them, simple and reasonable, and he found, to his own quiet horror, that answering it honestly was the last thing his instincts would allow. Somewhere in the fog of the last day, one thing had become clear to him even before his memory had fully returned. Someone had wanted him dead, someone close enough and careful enough to make it look like an accident, and if that person learned he had survived, they would try again, more carefully this time. He did not know, in that first moment, whether this woman before him was safe to trust with his name. He did not know if word of a missing duke had already spread this far from his family's lands, or whether speaking his own title aloud in a stranger's kitchen would be the very thing that brought his enemies to her door. So he lied, and the lie came easily, more easily than it should have. "Edwin," he said. "My name is Edwin." It was not entirely false. It was close enough to his own name that he thought he could remember to answer to it, and far enough from his title that it told her nothing true. Eleanor studied him a long moment, and he had the uncomfortable sense that she did not entirely believe him, though she did not press the point. Instead she rose, moved to the hearth, and ladled something warm from a small pot into a cup, which she pressed into his hands once he had managed, with effort, to sit upright against the wall. "Drink that," she said. "It is only broth. You have had quite enough of whatever was in you when I found you." His hand trembled slightly as he took the cup, and he saw her notice, saw the flicker of something like concern cross her tired features, before she smoothed it away, into the same careful, guarded expression she seemed to wear as a kind of armor. "What do you remember?" she asked, settling back into her chair. "Of how you came to be in that river?" He drank the broth slowly, using the time to think, to decide how much truth a lie could safely carry. "Very little," he said, which was true enough now, though it would not remain true for long, as the fog in his mind continued to clear through the day. "I remember cold. I remember being unable to move my own limbs. I do not remember how I came to be in the water at all. You smelled of laudanum when I found you," she said, watching his face closely. "A good deal of it, by the strength of it. That is not something that happens to a man by accident." He kept his expression as blank as he could manage, though something in him went cold at how quickly she had guessed at the truth of it. "I would not know," he said. "As I said, I remember very little." She did not look satisfied with the answer, but she did not push further either, and he found himself grateful for that. and also uneasy. Because a woman who noticed the smell of laudanum on a stranger's skin and drew the correct conclusion from it was not a woman who would remain ignorant for long, however careful he was. "Your clothes," she said after a moment, nodding toward where they hung, still damp, over a line strung near the fire to dry, "are finer than most men wear in this town. And that ring on your hand is not the sort of thing a common man owns." His fingers moved instinctively to cover the ring on his smallest finger, an old habit he had not even realized he still carried, and he saw her eyes catch the movement and understand something from it, though she said nothing more. "I do not know what to tell you," he said, and this, at least, was entirely true, beyond what I have already said. "I do not remember much before the water." It was, he thought, a poor performance, the kind of half-truth that would not survive careful questioning from anyone patient enough to keep asking. But Eleanor Hart, whatever else she was, did not seem inclined to interrogate a man she had just pulled from a river and nursed through the night. She rose instead, moved to check the fire, and when she spoke again her voice had softened slightly, though the wariness in it had not entirely gone. "Well, Edwin," she said, testing the false name with a faint, dry note in her voice that made him wonder, uncomfortably, whether she believed a word of it. "Whoever you are, and whatever brought you to my river, you are welcome to stay here until you are strong enough to go wherever it is you need to go. I ask only two things of you in return." "Name them," he said. "That you do nothing to endanger this house, or the people in this town. Whatever trouble follows you here," she said, and her eyes, when they met his, were sharp, despite the exhaustion in them. "And that when you are ready to tell me the truth, you tell me the truth, and not before, and not a lie dressed up to look like one. I have little patience left for either debts or falsehoods, and I suspect you may end up costing me more of both than I can easily bear." He held her gaze, feeling, for the first time since waking in a stranger's kitchen, with no memory of how he had come to be there, something other than fear or calculation. It was a small thing, barely noticeable beneath the ache in his skull, and the sick unease of a lie already told. But it was there, a flicker of something like shame, that he had answered honesty with deception, on his very first waking breath in her house. "Thank you," he said quietly, and meant it more than he had meant anything he had said since opening his eyes. "For the river, for the fire, for not asking more than I can safely answer." Eleanor studied him a moment longer, then nodded once, as if some private matter had been settled in her own mind, and turned back to her small kitchen, to the ordinary business of the morning, as though she had not spent her night dragging a half-drowned stranger out of black water, and did not now have every reason in the world to be afraid of what she had brought into her home. Outside, the town of Millbrook was waking slowly under a pale gray sky, unaware that somewhere along the river path, a set of careful boot prints in the mud, still visible if anyone thought to look, led away from the water and did not lead back, and that whoever had left a drugged man to drown the night before was, at that very hour, already beginning to wonder why no word had come confirming that the matter was finished. 3 days passed before Edwin could stand without the room tilting around him, and in that time Eleanor learned more about silence than she had ever expected to learn from a single houseguest. He did not speak of himself unless she asked, and even then his answers came thin and careful, like a man counting coins he could not afford to spend. He did not complain of pain, though she saw it cross his face often enough, in the stiff way he held his shoulder, in the sharp breath he sometimes took when he shifted too quickly. He ate what she gave him without comment, though she noticed, on the second morning, a small pause before he lifted the plain wooden spoon to his mouth, as though some part of him expected silver instead and had to remind itself otherwise. It was that pause, small as it was, that told her more than any of his careful non-answers had. "You are not accustomed to eating from wood," she said, setting a second cup of tea before him on the fourth morning, watching his face as she said it. He glanced up, and for the briefest moment something flickered behind his eyes, quickly hidden. "Wood serves its purpose," he said, which was not a denial, and they both seemed to understand that it was not. Eleanor did not press him further. She had decided, somewhere in the space of those first days, that pressing a wounded and frightened man for truths he was not ready to give would only teach him to guard himself more carefully, and she found, against her own better judgment, that she did not want him guarded around her. She could not have said exactly why. Perhaps it was only that her house had been quiet for 3 years, and even a silent, secretive stranger filled it in a way that felt, however dangerous, less lonely. Instead, she put him to work. It began almost by accident, on the 4th day, when he came slowly and carefully down the narrow steps from the small room above the kitchen, where she had finally moved him once he could walk unaided, and found her at the press in the shop next door, struggling alone with a heavy tray of type that had slipped from its frame. "Let me help," he said, and before she could tell him, he was still too weak. He had already crossed the room and taken the far end of the tray, lifting it with more care than skill, his grip clumsy and uncertain, in a way that made her look at him more closely. "You have never done this before," she said, not quite a question. "No," he admitted, setting the tray down carefully where she directed. "But I imagine I can learn." He could not, in truth, learn quickly. His hands, though strong, had clearly spent little time doing work that required patience with small, fiddly things, and he set type backward twice before she caught the error, and smudged ink across his sleeve in a way that made him wince, as though ruining a coat he could easily replace still cost him something to see spoiled. But he did not give up, and that surprised her more than his clumsiness did. He came back the next day, and the day after, standing beside her at the press for hours at a time, learning the strange backward logic of setting letters so that when printed, they would read the right way round, learning to ink the plate evenly, learning the particular strength needed to work the press's heavy arm, without either too little pressure or too much. They did not speak much, at first, while they worked, but slowly, over the hours, small conversations began to grow between the necessary silences, the way weeds find their way up through cracks in stone. "Why do you print?" he asked her, on the 6th day, as she checked a fresh sheet against the light for errors. "Because my husband did," she said, "and because I am not willing to let his work die, simply because he did." She set the sheet down and looked at the press, at the worn wooden frame that had been in Henry's family for 2 generations before it came to them. "And because I am good at it, and there are not many things left to me that I am allowed to be good at, as a widow, with no sons and no brothers to inherit in my place." "That seems an unfair arrangement," he said quietly, "that a woman's skill should matter less than a woman's relations." She glanced at him, surprised by the observation, and by the quiet certainty in his voice, as though he had given the matter real thought, rather than simply offering polite sympathy. "It is the arrangement we have," she said, "fair or not." "Arrangements can be changed," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, some old certainty beneath the careful blankness he usually wore, that made her look at him more closely. "Easy words," she said, "for a man with no shop to lose, and no debt hanging over his head." Something crossed his face then, quick and complicated, gone before she could name it. "Perhaps," he said, and offered nothing further, and she let the silence settle back between them, filing the strange moment away, with the others she had begun collecting. Small pieces of a puzzle, she did not yet have enough parts to solve. It was on the 7th day that Walter Grimsby came to the shop in person, and Eleanor understood, watching Edwin's reaction to the guildmaster's arrival, that whatever secret he was keeping had not made him a stranger to power, or to men who wielded it carelessly. Grimsby was a heavy man, soft in the middle but hard around the eyes, dressed always slightly better than his station required, as though the fine cut of his coat might disguise the fact that his fortune had been built more on other men's misfortune than on any skill of his own. He came into the shop without knocking, as he always did, and looked around with the particular satisfaction of a man surveying something he expected soon to own. "Mistress Hart," he said, his eyes moving briefly and dismissively over Edwin before returning to Eleanor. "I trust you have given thought to my offer." "I have given thought to nothing else," Eleanor said, keeping her voice level with an effort that cost her more than she let show. "And my answer has not changed. This shop is not for sale, to you or to anyone." "The debt says otherwise," Grimsby said, and there was a note of pleasure in his voice that made Eleanor's hands curl into fists at her sides, hidden in the folds of her apron. "A debt is a debt, Mistress Hart. Whatever fond feelings you may have for the press it is attached to, you have until the week's end. After that, the matter passes to the magistrate, and I doubt he will be as patient with your sentiment as I have been." He turned to go, and his eyes caught, briefly, on Edwin, standing quiet and still by the press, ink still faintly staining his sleeve. Something in Grimsby's expression sharpened, a merchant's habit of assessing anything and anyone that might carry value. "And who is this?" Grimsby asked, "helping you with your work these days, Mistress Hart? I had not heard you'd taken on an apprentice." "A distant relation," Eleanor said smoothly, before Edwin could answer, the lie coming to her lips with a speed that surprised even herself. "Come to stay a while, and help where he can." Grimsby's gaze lingered a moment longer on Edwin, on the fine remains of his ruined coat, now cleaned and mended, but still clearly cut from better cloth than anything Millbrook's tailors produced, and something calculating moved behind his eyes, before he seemed to decide the matter was not worth further attention. "See that you have the sum by week's end," he said to Eleanor, and left without another word. The shop was silent for a long moment, after the door closed behind him. "A distant relation," Edwin said finally, a faint, wry note in his voice, that Eleanor had not heard from him before. "It seems simpler than the truth," Eleanor said, "which is that I do not know who you are, and would rather Walter Grimsby did not know that either, given how quickly he seizes on anything that might be turned to his advantage." Edwin was quiet a moment, his expression thoughtful, in a way that made Eleanor wonder what calculations were moving behind it. "This debt," he said finally, "tell me of it." "It is not your concern," Eleanor said, more sharply than she intended, and immediately regretted the tone, though she did not take it back. She had grown, over the years since Henry's death, deeply uncomfortable with anyone offering to shoulder her burdens, as though accepting help were the same as admitting she could not manage alone. "You pulled a stranger from a river and gave him shelter without knowing his name," Edwin said, quiet but firm. "I think you have already made it my concern, whether you intended to or not." She looked at him then, really looked, at the steady, careful way he held himself despite the exhaustion of the past days, at the quiet authority in his voice that seemed entirely at odds with the humble story of a nameless traveler washed downstream by misfortune, and felt, not for the first time, the uneasy sense that there was a great deal more to the man standing in her shop than either of them had yet said aloud. "It is a debt my husband owed before he died," she said finally, because refusing to answer at all felt, suddenly, like its own kind of unkindness, after everything he had endured in her care. "Grimsby holds the paper on it, and has held it for 3 years, content to let the interest grow, while he waited for a moment, when seizing the shop would cost him nothing in reputation. I believe that moment has now arrived." Edwin said nothing for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the press, on the worn wooden frame Eleanor had spent years keeping alive through sheer stubbornness. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she had not heard in it before, something that sounded almost like a promise, though she could not yet understand what a nameless, penniless stranger could possibly promise her that would matter. "I am sorry," he said, "that you carry a debt that was never yours to carry." "Sorry does not pay Walter Grimsby," Eleanor said, though not unkindly, turning back to the press to hide the sudden and unwelcome sting of tears she refused to let fall in front of him. "No," Edwin agreed quietly, behind her, "it does not. Not yet." She did not understand, in that moment, what he meant by the small, strange word at the end of his sentence. She would not understand it for some time yet, not until far more had been revealed between them than either of them was currently prepared to say, and not until the quiet, careful stranger she had pulled from the river had shown her a great deal more of who he truly was, both the parts that frightened her, and the parts that, despite every warning her own good sense offered her, had already begun to matter far more than she was ready to admit. News of the missing Duke of Weyburn reached Millbrook the way most important news reached small towns, carried not by official messengers, but by the loose, eager talk of travelers who had heard it somewhere else, and could not wait to be the first to repeat it. It arrived first at the market, in the mouth of a grain merchant who had come up from the county town with his weekly cart, and by midday it had spread through every stall and doorway, growing larger and stranger with each retelling, the way rumors always do, when the people spreading them have more curiosity than facts to satisfy it. Eleanor heard it from Margaret Fenwick, her closest neighbor, a widow herself, though older, and blessed or cursed, depending on the day, with an appetite for gossip that made her both an excellent source of news and a woman Eleanor was careful never to fully confide in. "They say the Duke of Weyburn has vanished entirely," Margaret said, leaning over the low fence between their yards while Eleanor hung washing in the thin afternoon sun. Edwin safely inside the shop, out of earshot, or so Eleanor hoped. Gone from a hunting party not 3 weeks past, upriver from here, and no trace of him found since. His family has offered a reward for word of him, dead or alive, and half the county is talking of nothing else. How dreadful, Eleanor said, because it seemed the expected response, though her mind was already turning over the timing of it. 3 weeks past, upriver, and a man pulled from her own stretch of the river, not a fortnight ago, drugged and beaten, and unwilling to give his true name. She told herself the thought was foolish, even as she had it. Dukes did not end up half-drowned in ordinary river towns, nursed back to health by printers' widows in modest kitchens. Dukes had guards, and carriages, and households full of people whose entire purpose was to prevent exactly the kind of misfortune that had befallen the man currently learning, with clumsy determination, to set type in her shop. And yet, what do they say he looks like? Eleanor asked, keeping her voice as idle as she could manage. This missing Duke? Margaret shrugged, hanging her own washing with the brisk efficiency of long practice. Dark-haired, they say. Young still, not yet 30. Handsome, if the tales are to be believed, though tales always make missing Dukes handsome, don't they? To make the search more romantic. She glanced sideways at Eleanor, with the particular sharpness of a woman who missed very little. Why do you ask? You have not taken an interest in Dukes before, that I've noticed. Idle curiosity, Eleanor said, and turned back to her washing, before her face could give away more than her voice already had, though she felt Margaret's eyes linger on her a moment longer, before the older woman let the subject drop, for now. That evening, once the shop had closed and the shutters were drawn, Eleanor found Edwin at the small table in her kitchen, his sleeves still rolled from the day's work. A book she had lent him open before him, though his eyes were fixed somewhere past the page, on some private and distant thought. There is talk in the market, she said, setting a bowl before him, watching his face carefully as she spoke, of a Duke gone missing from a hunting party upriver. 3 weeks passed. Something flickered across his expression, there and gone so quickly, that had she not been watching so closely, she might have missed it entirely. But she was watching closely, had been watching closely for days now, and she saw it. A stillness that had not been there a moment before. A careful blankness settling over his features like a shutter drawn across a window. Is there? He said, his voice carefully even. How unfortunate for his family. They say he is dark-haired, Eleanor said, not looking away from him now, and young, not yet 30, handsome, according to the tales, though I am told tales always make missing Dukes handsome. A common enough description, Edwin said, and reached for his spoon with a steadiness that Eleanor did not entirely believe, among a great many men who are not Dukes. Edwin, she said, and used the false name deliberately, watching to see whether it still fit him as easily as it had a week ago. Look at me. He looked up, and for a moment, just a moment, she saw something raw and frightened behind the careful control he wore like armor, before he smoothed it away again. I am not accusing you of anything, she said, more gently than she felt. I am only asking you to consider that I found you in the river 3 weeks ago. You said you remembered little. Drugged, in clothes finer than anything this town produces, wearing a ring. You clearly did not want Walter Grimsby to notice, and unwilling, even now, to tell me your true name. You will forgive me if the timing of a missing Duke, upriver from here, gives me pause. He set down his spoon slowly, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its careful evenness, though he did not yet say the words she suspected he was holding back. If I were such a man, he said carefully, if I were, hypothetically, someone of considerable name and consequence who had found himself the target of an attempt on his life, what would you have me do, Eleanor? Announce it to the whole of Millbrook, and trust that whoever tried to kill him once would not simply try again, more carefully, the moment they learned he still lived? The admission, hypothetical as he had framed it, still landed in the small kitchen like a stone dropped into still water, and Eleanor felt the ripples of it move through her, through every assumption she had built about the man she had been sharing her home and her days with, for the better part of 2 weeks. I would have you trust the person who pulled you from a river, and has asked nothing of you since but honesty, she said, and heard the hurt in her own voice before she could soften it. Hurt she had not expected, and did not entirely welcome. It was never about trust in you, he said, and there was something urgent in his voice now, something that reached past the careful walls he had kept so firmly in place since waking in her kitchen. It was about protecting you. If word reached the wrong ears that I was here, that you had found me, that you knew even a little of what happened to me, you would become a target as surely as I already am. I have said nothing, Eleanor, not because I do not trust you, but because I have already cost you enough, simply by asking you to hide a stranger in your home. I did not want to hand you a reason to be hunted as well. Eleanor stood very still, absorbing this. The fear and the flattery of it tangled together in a way she could not easily untangle. It was, she recognized slowly, the first entirely honest thing he had said to her since the moment he woke on her hearthrug and offered her a false name, and the honesty of it, even wrapped in continued evasion about the precise truth of who he was, mattered to her more than she was prepared to admit. "You still have not told me your true name," she said quietly. "No," he admitted, "not yet, but I will tell you this much, since you have earned at least that much of the truth. Everything you have suspected tonight is closer to correct than you perhaps expected it to be, and everything I have not yet said, I have not said to keep you safe, not to deceive you." It was not a full confession. It was not even, strictly, an honest one, since he still had not spoken the words Duke or Weyburn aloud in her kitchen. But it was more than he had given her before, and Eleanor found, sitting across from him in the low firelight, with the weight of half a truth settling between them, that she believed him, or wanted to, badly enough, that the distinction had stopped mattering quite as much as it should have. "Walter Grimsby comes for my shop within the week," she said finally, because the silence had grown too heavy to hold, and because some part of her needed to change the subject before she said something she was not yet ready to say. "Whatever you are, whoever you truly are, that trouble has not gone away, simply because we have found a larger one to discuss tonight." "No," Edwin agreed, and something in his voice had shifted, grown steadier, more certain, as though the small unburdening of the evening had settled something in him that had been unsettled since he woke. "It has not. But give me time, Eleanor. I may yet be of more use to you than either of us has yet allowed." She did not fully understand what he meant by that, not that night, sitting across the small table from a man whose true name she still did not know, whose enemies she could not yet name, and whose quiet promise carried a weight she could feel but not measure. She would understand it, in time, far better than she wanted to, and by then the careful, fragile piece of her kitchen, her shop, and her small, ordinary life in Millbrook would already be changing, in ways neither of them could yet fully see coming, carried toward them on the same current that had first brought Edwin, or whoever he truly was, drowning and nameless, into her hands. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither Eleanor nor Edwin spoke of directly, though both seemed to feel its quiet weight in equal measure. He no longer pretended, entirely, that he was merely a lost traveler with no name worth telling. She no longer pretended, entirely, that she believed his silences were only caution, and not also a kind of trust he was slowly learning to extend to her. Between the two of them, in the space where the full truth still had not been spoken, something else had begun to grow, small and careful, the way new plants grow in the crack of a stone wall, finding purchase where none seems possible. He had grown steadier on his feet by the second week, the bruise at his temple fading from deep purple to a sickly yellow-green, his strength returning enough that he no longer needed to rest after an hour at the press. His hands, too, had grown surer, no longer smudging ink across his cuffs with every careless movement, no longer setting letters backward more often than not. Eleanor found herself, more than once, watching him work with a kind of quiet satisfaction that had little to do with the shop's productivity, and a great deal to do with the particular way his brow furrowed in concentration, or the rare, unguarded laugh that occasionally escaped him when a stubborn piece of type refused to sit properly in its frame. "You are improving," she told him one afternoon, checking a fresh sheet against the window light, "though I would not yet trust you with anything requiring real delicacy." "High praise," he said dryly, wiping ink from his fingers with a rag, "from a woman who told me a fortnight ago that I set type as though I were fighting it rather than arranging it." "You were fighting it," Eleanor said, rather fiercely, as I recall. "I have never been taught to do anything with my hands before," he admitted, and there was something almost wondering in his voice. as though the observation surprised him even as he made it. It is strange, discovering at my age, that there is real satisfaction to be found in making a thing well, with one's own effort, rather than simply directing others to make it. Eleanor glanced at him, considering the words, considering all they implied about the life he had led before the river. A life of directing rather than doing. A life where his hands had apparently never needed to learn a trade, because other hands had always done such work for him. It must be strange, she said carefully, to find yourself here, among people who have always had to make things with their own hands, simply to survive. It has been, he agreed, and did not elaborate further, though the honesty of the small admission felt, to Eleanor, like another quiet gift passed between them, one of the small true things he allowed himself to say, even while the largest truth remained unspoken. It was during those weeks that she began to notice, with a kind of helpless clarity she could not quite argue herself out of, how often her thoughts turned to him, even when he was not in the room. She noticed the particular quiet of the shop when he stepped out to fetch water from the well, a quiet that had nothing wrong with it, and yet felt, somehow, incomplete. She noticed how she had begun, without quite deciding to, saving him the better piece of bread at supper, or the choicest bit of whatever small meat she managed to afford that week, the way one might do, without thinking, for someone whose comfort had quietly become important to her. She told herself, more than once, that this was foolishness of the most dangerous kind. Whatever he was, Duke, or something less grand but still far above her own modest station, he would not remain in Millbrook forever. Men like him, whatever their current misfortune, belonged eventually to grander houses, grander lives, and grander company than a printer's widow, with ink permanently staining her knuckles and a debt hanging over her shop, like a blade waiting to fall. And yet knowing this did nothing to slow the quiet, unwelcome warmth that grew in her chest each time she caught him watching her across the shop with an expression she could not quite name, something between wonder and worry, as though he, too, were fighting a battle against his own better judgment and losing it by slow degrees. It was Edwin who first acknowledged it aloud, though he did so carefully, the way he seemed to do everything, testing the ground before committing his full weight to it. "You work too hard," he said one evening, watching her rub at the ache in her shoulders after a long day at the press, her fingers stiff and stained black to the second knuckle. "You have not stopped moving since before dawn." "The shop does not run itself," Eleanor said, though she allowed herself to sink into the chair opposite him, grateful for the excuse to rest. "No," he agreed, "but it need not run only through your own exhaustion either." He hesitated, and she saw something careful cross his face, a decision being weighed. "Let me take on more of the heavier work. My back, at least, has fully recovered. Whatever remains uncertain about the rest of me." "You already do more than most guests would think to offer," Eleanor said, and meant it, though something in his phrasing, "whatever remains uncertain about the rest of me," caught at her attention and would not let go. "I do not think of myself as a guest any longer," he said quietly, and the words hung in the small kitchen, with a weight that neither of them seemed quite prepared for. "I have not for some time now, if I am honest with myself, and I find I would like to be honest with you as well, Eleanor, more than I have yet allowed myself to be." Her heart moved strangely in her chest at that, a mixture of hope and fear so tangled together she could not have separated them if she tried. "Then be honest," she said quietly, "if you are ready." He was quiet a long moment, his gaze fixed on his own hands, ink-stained now like hers, a small, absurd symbol of how far he had traveled from wherever he had begun. "Not yet," he admitted finally, and she saw the effort it cost him to say it, saw that it was not evasion, but genuine struggle, a man weighing a truth he knew would change everything, against a fear he had not yet found the courage to set down. "But soon, I promise you that much, Eleanor. Soon, and not because circumstance forces my hand, but because you deserve it freely given, and I find I want very badly to give it to you freely, when I am ready." It was not the confession she had half hoped for, sitting there in the quiet kitchen with the fire burning low and his hand resting, she noticed now, only inches from her own on the table between them. But it was a promise, and Eleanor, who had learned the hard way not to place too much faith in promises, found herself believing this one anyway, against every instinct that told her caution, and found, too, that she did not particularly want to stop herself from believing it. "Soon then," she said softly, and did not move her hand away when, after a moment's hesitation, his fingers came to rest lightly over hers, warm and steady, a small bridge built across the space, where the truth still had not yet been spoken. Neither of them noticed, in that quiet moment, the careful figure of Walter Grimsby passing along the lane outside, slowing his steps as he glanced through the gap in the shutters at the small tableau within, filing away what he saw there, with the same calculating attention he gave to every piece of information that might, one day, prove useful to him. Nor did they know, that same evening, that a traveler had arrived at the town's only inn, a man with sharp eyes and an old habit of remembering faces, who had spent the better part of the past 3 weeks searching every town along the river for exactly the kind of clue that Millbrook, quite without meaning to, had just begun to offer him. The magistrate's letter arrived on a gray morning, delivered by a boy who would not meet Eleanor's eyes as he handed it over, and she knew, before she had even broken the seal, exactly what it would say. Walter Grimsby had not waited the full week he had promised her. He had gone to the magistrate early, painted her as a widow unable to manage her late husband's debts, careless with an inheritance she had no right to keep, and secured an order that gave her only 3 days more before the shop, the press, and everything Henry had built would pass into Grimsby's hands as payment. She read the letter twice at the kitchen table, her hands steady, even as something inside her felt as though it were breaking quietly apart, and when Edwin came in from the yard and saw her face, he crossed the room in 3 quick strides and took the letter from her hands before she could stop him. She watched his expression change as he read it, watched the careful blankness he usually wore crack and give way to something sharper, colder, an anger she had not yet seen in him. 3 days, he said, his voice low and tight. He means to take everything from you in 3 days, on the word of a magistrate he has surely paid, or flattered into compliance. It is how these things are done, Eleanor said, with a weariness that came from long practice at accepting what could not be changed. A widow's word carries little weight against a guildmaster's, especially one who has spent years cultivating the right friendships. It should not be how these things are done, Edwin said, and there was a fierceness in his voice now that surprised her, a heat entirely unlike his usual careful restraint. You have done nothing wrong, Eleanor. You have kept this shop alive through years of hardship, through no fault of your own, against a debt that was never rightfully yours, and now a man who has profited from other people's misfortune for years means to profit from yours as well, simply because the law allows it, and no one has yet troubled to stop him. And what would you have me do? Eleanor asked, more sharply than she intended, the strain of the morning fraying her patience. Storm the magistrate's office myself, and demand justice? I have no name that carries weight in this town, Edwin, no family to call on, no coin to offer, that would outweigh whatever Grimsby has already promised. I have only this shop, and in 3 days I will not even have that. Edwin was quiet a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, grown quieter, more careful, though the fierceness had not entirely left it. What if I could help, he said. Truly help, Eleanor, not simply stand beside you while the worst happens. How? She asked, and heard the sharpness in her own voice soften into something more like desperate hope than she wanted to admit to. You have no name here either, Edwin. No coin of your own that I have seen. Nothing but the clothes on your back, which are not even truly yours to sell, since I mended them myself from what little remained after the river ruined them. Something moved across his face then, a decision forming behind his eyes, and she watched him open his mouth as though to say something significant, something that might finally answer every question she had carried since the night she pulled him from the water. Before he could speak it, the shop door opened, and a man Eleanor did not recognize stepped inside, older, well-dressed in the manner of someone who traveled a great deal and had learned to travel comfortably, his sharp eyes moving quickly over the room before settling, with sudden and complete attention, on Edwin's face. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Eleanor felt the hair rise on the back of her neck before anyone spoke a single word. Your Grace, the stranger said finally, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and disbelief so profound it seemed to shake the very air of the small shop. God in heaven, it is you. We had all but given up hope of finding you alive. Eleanor's gaze snapped to Edwin, watching every drop of color leave his face, watching him go rigid with a shock that told her, more clearly than any words could have, that whatever careful lie he had been maintaining for weeks had just been shattered in an instant by a man she had never seen before. "Colonel Ashford," Edwin said, his voice tight and strange. "You should not be here." "Should not be here," the man repeated, incredulous. "Your family has had search parties combing every river and every town within 30 miles for you, my lord. And I find you here, in a printer's shop, dressed like a common tradesman. And you tell me I should not be here." He turned, finally, to look properly at Eleanor, and something in his expression shifted, calculation replacing shock, the way a man's face changes when he begins to reckon the value of what he has just learned. "And who, may I ask, is this?" "This is Eleanor Hart," Edwin said, his voice carrying a warning Eleanor had never heard in it before, sharp enough to make even the stranger pause. "Who saved my life, and to whom you will speak with every courtesy, Colonel, or you will answer to me for it." The colonel's expression smoothed quickly into something more careful, more deferential, though Eleanor did not miss the sharp, assessing look he gave her, before he inclined his head in a bow that felt, to her, entirely surreal in the plain, ink-stained surroundings of her modest shop. "Mistress Hart," he said, "the gratitude of the entire Weyburn family belongs to you then, for whatever part you played in preserving His Grace's life." The words landed on Eleanor like stones dropped into still water, one after another, each ripple widening the gap between the man she thought she had come to know over the past weeks, and the truth now standing revealed before her. His Grace. Weyburn. She turned to look at Edwin, and found him watching her with an expression of such raw, naked fear that it struck her harder than the revelation itself had done. Fear not of the colonel, not of whatever danger had followed him from wherever he had truly come from, but fear, she understood slowly, of her, of what she would think of him now that the truth had been torn from him, before he had ever found the courage to give it freely, as he had promised her only days before. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice shook slightly, the careful control gone entirely now. "I meant to tell you. I swear to you, I meant to tell you myself, when I was ready, when I could be certain of finding the right words." "Your Grace," Eleanor repeated slowly, testing the strange weight of the title against everything she had believed about the quiet, clumsy man who had spent weeks learning to set type at her side, who had eaten from her plain wooden spoons without complaint, who had held her hand across her own kitchen table only days before, and promised her honesty, soon. "I am the Duke of Weyburn," Edwin said, and the words seemed to cost him something enormous to speak aloud, the last wall between them, finally, irrevocably, coming down. "Edmund Vane, though you have known me these past weeks as Edwin, a name close enough to my own, that I thought I could bear to answer to it, though I see now the cowardice of that choice as clearly as you must." The shop had gone entirely silent, the colonel watching the exchange with the careful, curious attention of a man gathering information he did not yet know how to use, and Eleanor stood very still amid the wreckage of every assumption she had built about the man before her, feeling something complicated and painful twist through her chest, hurt and understanding tangled together in a knot she could not easily loosen. 3 weeks, she said finally, quietly. 3 weeks I have kept you safe, taught you my trade, shared what little I had with you, and you let me believe you were nothing but a nameless stranger, even after I told you plainly that I would rather have the truth than a kindness dressed up as one. "I was afraid," Edmund said, and there was no defense in his voice now, only naked honesty, more honest than he had allowed himself to be, since the night she pulled him from the river. "Not of you, Eleanor. Never of you. I was afraid of what would change between us the moment you knew, afraid you would look at me the way the colonel is looking at you now, weighing what I might be worth to you, rather than simply seeing me as I am." Eleanor looked at him a long moment, aware of the colonel's watchful presence, aware of the weight of everything that had just shifted irrevocably between them, and found, beneath the hurt, a harder question rising, one that would not let her rest until she had asked it aloud. "And now that I know," she said, "what happens to everything you promised me, Edmund, Duke of Weyburn? What happens to the man who learned to set type at my side, and what becomes of the woman who taught him?" He did not answer immediately, and in the silence that stretched between them, heavy with everything still unresolved, the colonel cleared his throat, the practical urgency of the moment reasserting itself over whatever private reckoning still hung unfinished in the small, ink-stained shop. "Your Grace," he said, "forgive the interruption, but there is a matter of some urgency. Whoever arranged your disappearance believes, as of this morning, that the task was never finished. If they learn otherwise, that you live, that you have been found, I fear they will not hesitate to try again, and more carefully this time." Edmund's gaze did not leave Eleanor's face, even as he answered the colonel, and in his eyes she saw a promise reforming, more urgent now, more determined than the careful, tentative one he had offered her only days before. "Then we have very little time," he said, "to decide what happens next, both to the men who tried to end my life, and to everything that has grown, unlooked for and unplanned, between the woman who saved it and the man who very nearly lost far more than his name in the trying." Colonel Ashford was persuaded, after some quiet insistence from Edmund, to wait at the town's inn while matters in the shop were settled, and once the door had closed behind him, the small room felt smaller still, filled with everything that had not yet been said between the two people left standing in it. "Sit with me," Edmund said, "and let me tell you the whole of it, truly, this time, from the beginning. You have earned that much, and far more besides, and I find I cannot bear to let another hour pass with anything less than the full truth standing between us." Eleanor sat, though she kept her hands folded carefully in her lap, holding herself apart from him in a way she had not done since the earliest days of his recovery, and he noticed it, she could tell, though he did not ask her to close the distance before she was ready. "My father died 2 years ago," Edmund began, "and left me the dukedom of Weyburn, and everything that comes with it, lands and tenants, and a seat that carries more weight in certain rooms than I have ever felt entirely comfortable holding. I have a cousin, Alaric Vane, who believed, not without some reason, that he would have made a steadier duke than I have proven to be. He has spent 2 years cultivating support among certain members of our family, and certain men in positions of influence, quietly building the case that the dukedom would be better served in his hands than mine, should something unfortunate befall me before I marry, and produce an heir of my own." "And something unfortunate very nearly did," Eleanor said quietly. "Yes," Edmund said. "I went to a hunting party upriver, as the county has been saying, at the invitation of a family I believe to be friendly to mine. I do not yet know how deeply they were involved, whether they knew what Alaric intended, or were simply careless in whom they allowed near me during my stay. I remember very little of the actual night, only a cup offered to me by a servant I did not recognize, and after that, the fog you have already heard me describe, cold water, and hands that meant for me never to be found again." "Your own cousin," Eleanor said, "tried to have you killed." "I cannot yet prove it," Edmund said, "though I believe it with a certainty that frightens me more than the attempt itself did. And that is precisely why I could not tell you the truth the moment I woke in your kitchen, Eleanor. If word had reached Alaric, or whoever else may be involved with him, that I had survived and been found, sheltered by a kind stranger in a river town, I feared what might have happened next, not only to me, but to you, for the simple crime of having pulled a duke from the water and refused to let him die." Eleanor was quiet a long moment, turning the whole shape of it over in her mind, the fear he had carried silently through every day of his recovery, the careful lie he had maintained not out of any wish to deceive her for its own sake, but out of a desperate, perhaps misguided attempt to keep danger as far from her door as he could manage. "You should have trusted me sooner," she said finally, and the hurt in her voice was honest, unhidden. "Not with every detail, perhaps, but with enough of the truth that I might have understood what I was truly risking, and chosen it with open eyes, rather than being led into danger I did not know I stood in." "You are right," Edmund said, without argument, without excuse. "I told myself I was protecting you, and perhaps in part I was, but I know now that some part of my silence was also fear, plain and selfish, fear that the moment you knew what I truly was, everything easy and honest that had grown between us these past weeks would change, that you would see a duke standing where you had only ever seen a man, and that the man would somehow be lost in the seeing." "I do see a duke now," Eleanor said quietly, "and I confess I do not yet know what to do with the sight of him, sitting at my table, having eaten from my wooden spoons, and slept beneath my roof, and learned my trade with his own 2 hands, while all the while, carrying a title I could never have imagined, attached to the man I had come to know. Then know this, Edmund said, and he reached across the table, though he did not take her hand, only rested his own near it, an offering, rather than a claim. Whatever title follows me, whatever grand house waits for me once this danger has passed, the man who sat at your table these past weeks was no performance, Eleanor. I did not learn to value patience, or honest labor, or the particular satisfaction of work well done with my own hands, because I was pretending to be someone worth your kindness. I learned those things because you taught them to me, without ever meaning to, simply by being exactly who you are, and I do not know how to set that lesson aside now, even armed with the truth of who I have always been beneath it. Eleanor felt something in her chest loosen slightly at that, though the hurt had not entirely gone, and she was honest enough with herself to know that trust, once shaken, did not simply rebuild itself in a single conversation, however sincere. What happens now, she asked, to you, and to whatever danger still follows you? Colonel Ashford will need to escort me back to Weyburn, Edmund said, so that I might be seen alive by witnesses who cannot be bought or silenced, and so that whatever proof exists of Alaric's involvement might be gathered before he learns I live and has the chance to hide it, or worse, to try again with greater care. And Walter Grimsby, Eleanor said, the practical urgency of her own crisis reasserting itself despite everything else weighing on her mind, comes for my shop in 3 days' time. Whatever becomes of dukes and cousins and conspiracies upriver. Edmund's expression hardened slightly, the fierce anger she had glimpsed earlier returning, tempered now by the calm certainty of a man who suddenly, visibly, remembered that he possessed far more power to address such matters than he had held only an hour before. Grimsby will not take your shop, he said, and there was no doubt in his voice at all now, only quiet, absolute resolve. Whatever else remains uncertain in my own affairs, I have the authority, and I mean fully to use it, to see that a man who has built his fortune on other people's misfortune does not add your ruin to his ledger. I will not leave Millbrook, Eleanor, until that matter is settled beyond any further threat, whatever the Colonel's urgency about my return. You cannot delay your own safety for the sake of my shop, Eleanor said, though something in her chest warmed, despite her better sense at the fierce protectiveness in his voice. I have delayed a great many things, Edmund said, out of fear, these past weeks. I do not intend to add this to the list. They sat together a while longer in the quiet shop, the ink smell and the worn wooden press and the low gray light through the shutters, all exactly as they had been for weeks, and yet everything between them had shifted, irrevocably, into a shape neither of them yet fully understood how to hold. Eleanor did not know, sitting there, whether the trust she had begun to build with a nameless stranger could survive the sudden, overwhelming weight of a duke's title now standing between them. She knew only that the man before her, whatever else he was, had not lied about the small, quiet truths, the satisfaction of honest work, the value of patience, the particular way he had come, slowly, and without either of them quite noticing it happen, to matter to her far more than caution would have advised. Outside, the gray afternoon was already beginning to darken toward evening, and somewhere along the road that led away from Millbrook toward the county town, Colonel Ashford waited at the inn with growing impatience, unaware that the Duke he had traveled so far, and so anxiously to find, had just made a quiet, private decision to delay his triumphant return a little longer, for the sake of a printer's shop, and the widow who had refused, against every reasonable instinct, to let a drowning stranger die. Walter Grimsby was in an excellent mood when he arrived at the print shop the following morning, humming faintly to himself as he approached the door, already composing in his mind the pleasant letter he would soon write to the magistrate, confirming that the widow's shop had passed, at last, into his possession. The mood did not survive his first step through the doorway. Edmund stood waiting for him, no longer dressed in the mended, ink-stained clothes of a printer's assistant, but in a fresh coat Colonel Ashford had brought from the county town the previous evening, dark and well-cut, the kind of garment that announced, without a single word needing to be spoken, that the man wearing it belonged to a world entirely different from the one Grimsby had assumed him to occupy. "Mr. Grimsby," Edmund said, his voice carrying none of the careful, halting caution it had held during his weeks of recovery, but instead a cold, easy authority that seemed to fill the small shop entirely. "I understand you have come about a debt." Grimsby's eyes moved quickly over the fine coat, the confident bearing, the signet ring now worn openly on Edmund's smallest finger, rather than hidden beneath a cuff, and something uneasy flickered behind his usual bluster. "I do not believe we have been introduced," Grimsby said carefully. "Edmund Vane," Edmund said, "Duke of Weyburn. I believe you have met Mistress Hart's distant relation before, though I confess, the introduction was somewhat incomplete at the time." The color drained slowly from Grimsby's face as the meaning of the words settled over him, and Eleanor, watching from beside the press, felt a fierce, unexpected satisfaction at the sight of the guildmaster's confidence crumbling in real time. "Your Grace," Grimsby managed finally, his voice considerably smaller than it had been a moment before. "I had no notion, no idea whatsoever, that a man of your standing was present in—" "No," Edmund agreed, "you did not. Which makes what I am about to say rather simpler for me to enforce than it might otherwise have been. I have reviewed the terms of the debt you hold against this shop, and I find them considerably more generous to your own interests than the original sum Mistress Hart's late husband actually borrowed. Interest compounded at a rate no honest lender would apply, penalties added without proper notice, and a final sum that bears only the faintest resemblance to what was actually owed. The terms are entirely lawful," Grimsby said, though his voice had lost the certainty it usually carried. "They may be lawful," Edmund said, "in the narrowest possible reading of a law that has clearly been shaped, over years, by men in your own guild, to favor exactly this kind of arrangement. I do not dispute that the letter of it may protect you from the magistrate. I would ask you to consider, however, whether it will protect you from me, and from the rather considerable interest I intend to take, going forward, in the affairs of this town, and the manner in which its merchants conduct their business." Grimsby swallowed visibly. "What is it you propose, Your Grace?" "I propose," Edmund said, "that you accept from me, this morning, the original sum Henry Hart actually borrowed, without a single farthing of your invented interest attached, and that you sign, in the presence of Colonel Ashford here as witness, a full release of any claim whatsoever against this shop, this press, or Mistress Hart's person or property, now or at any future time. I propose further that you consider very carefully, in the weeks to come, whether similar arrangements you have made with other widows and tradesmen in this town might benefit from a similarly generous reconsideration, before I find myself with sufficient leisure to examine your ledgers in closer detail than either of us would likely enjoy." The threat, delivered in the same calm, even voice Edmund had used throughout, seemed to land with far greater weight than any shout could have managed, and Eleanor watched Grimsby's shoulders sag slightly under it, the man's usual bluster entirely deflated. "I will have the papers drawn up within the hour, Your Grace," Grimsby said. "See that you do," Edmund said. "And Mr. Grimsby, one further matter. You have known Mistress Hart for some years, I understand, and you have chosen, in that time, to treat her hardship as an opportunity, rather than a misfortune, deserving of a decent man's sympathy. I would suggest, going forward, that you find a different approach to widows in this town, and to anyone else whose circumstances leave them without the means to fight you on equal terms. I have found, in the course of my own recent misfortune, that the world contains a surprising number of decent people, willing to risk a great deal for a stranger's sake, and rather too few men, willing to extend even the smallest kindness, when it costs them nothing at all. I would encourage you to consider which kind of man you wish to be remembered as, before circumstance forces the question upon you as unexpectedly as it was forced upon me." Grimsby left within the quarter hour, considerably paler than he had arrived, and Eleanor stood in the sudden quiet of the shop afterward, staring at Edmund with an expression somewhere between disbelief and a fierce, unfamiliar gratitude that she did not quite know how to voice. "You did not need to threaten his entire ledger," she said finally, "to settle my debt." "No," Edmund agreed, "I did not. But I found, watching him enter this shop this morning so pleased with himself over a widow's ruin, that I did not particularly wish to show restraint on his behalf." He paused, his expression softening slightly as he looked at her. "You have carried this burden alone for 3 years, Eleanor. I could not undo those years. I could at least see that they ended today, and that Grimsby thinks rather more carefully, before he tries to build his fortune on someone else's grief again." Before Eleanor could find the words to answer him, the shop door opened once more, and Colonel Ashford entered, his expression tight with an urgency that immediately silenced whatever warmth had begun to build between them. "Your Grace," the colonel said, We have received word from the county town. Lord Alaric has learned of your survival. A rider passed through not 2 hours ago, and I fear news of your presence here in Millbrook will reach him before nightfall, if it has not already." Edmund's expression hardened instantly, the softness of a moment before, replaced entirely by the careful, wary stillness Eleanor remembered from his earliest days in her kitchen, the look of a man who understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that danger had found him again. "Then we have very little time left to decide what happens next," he said, "and I fear, Eleanor, that whatever quiet I hope to build with you, in the safety of this shop, is about to be tested rather more severely than either of us would wish." Eleanor felt a cold weight settle in her stomach at the words, the fragile peace of the past weeks giving way, all at once, to the understanding that the danger she had pulled from the river had never truly gone away, only slept, waiting for the moment it would rise again, to threaten everything she had allowed herself, against all caution, to begin hoping for. They did not have to wait until nightfall. Barely 2 hours after Colonel Ashford's warning, a carriage far too fine for Millbrook's narrow streets rattled to a stop outside the print shop, and Eleanor, watching through the gap in the shutters, felt her stomach tighten at the sight of the crest painted on its door, a wolf's head circled by ivy. The mark, Edmund told her quietly beside her, of House Vane. "He has come himself," Edmund said, and there was something in his voice, tightly controlled, that told Eleanor how much effort it cost him to keep his composure at the sight of the carriage. "I did not expect him to be so bold as to come in person." "Perhaps boldness is easier," Eleanor said, "for a man who believes he has already won." The man who stepped down from the carriage a moment later was younger than Eleanor had expected, fair where Edmund was dark, handsome in a sharp, watchful way that reminded her uncomfortably of a hawk assessing a field before it chose where to strike. He wore his confidence like a well-fitted coat, and when he stepped into the shop, his eyes moved over Edmund with a flicker of surprise quickly smoothed into practiced calm. "Cousin," he said, "you look remarkably well, for a man 3 weeks drowned." "Alaric," Edmund said, and the single word carried more restraint than Eleanor had thought possible, given everything she now understood about what this man had tried to do. "You seem less surprised to find me alive than a loyal cousin ought to be." "I am simply relieved," Alaric said smoothly, "as the whole family has been, that the rumors of your unfortunate accident proved exaggerated." His gaze moved briefly to Eleanor, assessing, dismissive, before returning to Edmund. "Though I confess I am curious how a Duke of Weyburn came to spend 3 weeks recovering in a printer's shop, dressed, from what I am told, rather more humbly than his station requires." "I imagine you are curious about a great many details of that night," Edmund said, "given that you arranged most of them yourself." The accusation, spoken plainly at last, hung in the shop's quiet air, and Eleanor watched Alaric's composure hold, though something tightened at the corners of his eyes. "A serious charge," Alaric said, "and one I trust you do not intend to make without proof, cousin, given how poorly baseless accusations tend to reflect on the men who make them." "Colonel Ashford," Edmund said, without looking away from his cousin, "the letter, if you would." The colonel stepped forward and produced a folded paper, which he held out, not to Edmund, but to Alaric himself, a small gesture of confidence that Eleanor understood only when she saw the color drain from Alaric's face as his eyes moved over its contents. "We found it," Edmund said, "among the belongings of the servant who offered me the cup that night, a man who has since been located, and who proved considerably more willing to speak honestly, once he understood that the alternative was standing trial alone, for a crime his employer had directed him to commit. The letter, as you can see, bears your seal, cousin, and rather explicit instructions regarding the timing and manner of my unfortunate accident." Alaric's hand trembled faintly as he lowered the letter, though his voice, when he spoke again, retained a last, desperate edge of defiance. "A forgery," he said, "easily produced by anyone wishing to see me disgraced." "Perhaps," Edmund said, "though I suspect the magistrate in the county town, and the members of our family who have gathered there awaiting news of my fate, will take considerable interest in examining the matter closely, alongside the sworn testimony of the servant who carried out your instructions. I do not think, Alaric, that a forgery defense will serve you nearly so well as you hope, once every detail is laid before people who have no reason left to protect you." The fight seemed to go out of Alaric all at once, his shoulders sagging in a manner that reminded Eleanor, unwillingly, of Grimsby's collapse only hours before, though the stakes here were graver by far, a man's life having been the target, rather than merely a shop's ownership. "You will ruin the family name," Alaric said quietly, dragging this into public view. "You ruined the family name," Edmund said, "the moment you decided my life was worth less than your ambition. I will not pretend to spare you the consequence of that choice, merely to preserve an appearance of unity that was never true to begin with." Colonel Ashford stepped forward then, his manner brisk and official, and informed Alaric, in careful, formal language, that he would be escorted back to the county town to answer for the charges now laid against him, and that any attempt to flee or resist would only worsen a case already built on evidence he could not easily dispute. Alaric left without further protest, his fine carriage rattling away from Millbrook's narrow streets far less triumphantly than it had arrived, and Eleanor stood beside Edmund in the sudden quiet that followed, watching the dust settle in the empty lane, hardly able to believe that the danger following him these past weeks had finally, truly, been resolved. "It is over then," she said softly. "The immediate danger, yes," Edmund said, though his expression remained thoughtful, unsettled in a way that told her the matter was not entirely closed in his own mind. "There will be a great deal more to attend to now, testimony to give, family matters to untangle, a household that has spent 3 weeks in mourning and confusion, and will need considerable reassurance that their Duke has returned to them whole." He turned to look at her fully then, and something in his expression grew careful, almost afraid, in a way she had not expected to see now that the true danger had passed. "I must return to Weyburn, Eleanor, and soon. There is no way around it." "I understand," Eleanor said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she did understand, even as something in her chest ached at the plain fact of his coming departure. "I do not wish to leave you believing this is simply the end of it," Edmund said, taking a step closer, his voice low and urgent now. "I know what promises must sound like, spoken by a man about to ride away toward a life very different from the one he has shared with you these past weeks. I know you have little reason to trust easily in such promises, given everything else you have carried alone these past years. But I am asking you to trust this one regardless, Eleanor. I will return for you. Not out of any debt I believe I owe you, though I owe you a debt beyond counting, but because these past weeks, learning your trade beside you, sharing your table, coming slowly to know the whole of who you are, beneath the careful composure you wear as armor much as I wear mine, have mattered to me more than anything in my life before the river." Eleanor looked at him a long moment, weighing the promise against every hard lesson life had taught her about believing in things too readily, and found, despite every caution, that she wanted, badly, to believe him. "Go," she said finally, softly. "Settle what must be settled. And Edmund, if you mean to return, then return. I have buried one man's promises already. I do not think I have the strength left to bury a second set, even a duke's." "Then I will make certain," Edmund said, "that you never have to." He left within the hour, Colonel Ashford's carriage carrying him away from Millbrook down the same river road that had first brought him, drowning and nameless, into Eleanor's hands, and she stood in the doorway of her shop long after the carriage had disappeared from sight, watching the empty road, wondering, despite every fierce hope she carried, whether she had just witnessed the last of him, or only the beginning of something she had not yet allowed herself to properly imagine. 3 weeks passed without a single word from Weyburn, and Eleanor filled them the only way she knew how, with work. She told herself, each morning, that the silence meant nothing, that a duke restored to his household after so grave a scandal would have 100 urgent matters demanding his attention before he could turn his thoughts to a printer's widow in a small river town. She told herself this at the press each day, setting type with hands that had grown steady again in his absence, and she told herself this each night, lying awake in the small room above the shop, listening to the same river that had once carried him to her, wondering whether it might yet carry him away for good. Margaret Fenwick, who had heard the whole astonishing story by now, along with the rest of Millbrook, watched Eleanor with a mixture of sympathy and barely concealed curiosity that Eleanor found equal parts comforting and exhausting. "A duke," Margaret said one afternoon, not for the first time, shaking her head over the washing line between their yards. A real duke. In your kitchen. Mending torn coats and eating from wooden spoons. I could scarcely credit it when I heard, and I still find myself half doubting it, except that half the town saw his carriage leave with their own eyes. He is gone now, Eleanor said, keeping her voice carefully even, and there is no saying whether he will return at all, so I would rather not build too much hope on what may prove to be nothing more than a strange chapter already closed. You do not believe that, Margaret said shrewdly. Not for a moment, whatever brave face you put on it for my benefit. Eleanor did not answer, because Margaret was right, and admitting it aloud felt like tempting a fate she was not yet ready to test. It was on a gray morning, near the start of the 4th week, with the shop quiet and the press standing idle, while Eleanor swept the floor with more force than the task strictly required, that she heard a carriage in the lane outside, finer by far than anything Millbrook's own streets usually produced. Her heart climbed into her throat before she had even set down the broom. She reached the door just as the carriage came to a stop, and for one terrible moment, watching the door open and a figure step down, she feared it might be Colonel Ashford alone, come with some careful, kind message, explaining why the Duke himself could not return, could never truly have belonged in her small shop to begin with. But it was Edmund who stepped down, dressed now in the full, unmistakable finery of his true station. A dark coat, cut with a precision no Millbrook tailor could match, and yet his face, when his eyes found hers across the small distance of the lane, held exactly the same expression she remembered from countless quiet mornings at the press, warm, and a little uncertain, and entirely, unmistakably himself. You came back, Eleanor said, and heard her own voice break slightly on the words, all the careful composure of the past 3 weeks dissolving at once. I told you I would, Edmund said, closing the distance between them. I have spent 3 weeks setting matters right at Weyburn, Eleanor. Alaric has confessed fully, faced with the weight of evidence against him, and will answer for his crime before the proper courts. My household has been reassured that their duke has returned to them sound in body, and, I hope, considerably wiser than the man who left them for that hunting party. And I have spent no small portion of those 3 weeks, I confess, thinking of very little besides a printer's shop by the river, and the woman who taught a duke, without ever meaning to, the true worth of honest work and honest company. 3 weeks of silence, Eleanor said, though there was no real anger left in it now, only the ache of having waited, and the relief of the waiting finally ending. Felt considerably longer than 3 weeks, Edmund. I am sorry for that, he said. I did not want to write you a hurried letter, full of promises I had not yet earned the right to make good on. I wanted to come to you only once I could offer you something whole, not merely fine words carried by a messenger, while the truth of my circumstances remained unsettled behind me. He reached into his coat then and produced a folded paper, which he handed to her with a careful, almost nervous formality that seemed strange on a man who had, only weeks before, dismantled Walter Grimsby's confidence with a few calm sentences. Eleanor unfolded it slowly and found, written in a clerk's careful hand and sealed with the mark of the Weyburn estate, a full and formal release of every claim against her shop and press, along with a deed transferring to her name outright the small building and the land beneath it, free of any debt or obligation whatsoever, and beneath that, a second document, granting funds sufficient to expand the shop, to hire proper help, to secure her trade against hardship for the whole of her lifetime. Edmund, she began, I cannot accept. You can, he said gently, and I hope you will, though I confess, this is not truly why I have come, only a small matter I wished settled, before we spoke of anything larger between us. I do not offer this out of debt, Eleanor, though I owe you a debt beyond any sum a clerk could properly calculate. I offer it because your trade matters to you, because you built something worth preserving out of very little, and because I would rather see it flourish under your own hand than see it hang forever under threat of another Walter Grimsby, in whatever years remain to either of us. Eleanor looked up from the papers, her eyes bright with tears she no longer felt any need to hide from him, and found him watching her with an expression of such open, unguarded hope that it took her breath away, more completely than any deed or title could have managed. You said, she managed, that this was not why you had come. What, then, is the larger matter you spoke of? Edmund took her hand then, there in the lane outside her shop, in full view of Margaret Fenwick's frankly delighted eavesdropping over the fence, and of half the curious town besides, who had gathered at a respectful distance the moment word spread that the Duke's carriage had returned. "I have spent my whole life," he said, "surrounded by people who valued me for my title, before they ever troubled to know the man beneath it. You pulled a drowning stranger from a river, Eleanor, and gave him shelter and honest work and honest company, never once knowing what he was, only who he was becoming in your care. I have never in my life been given a gift so precious as that, and I find I have no wish to spend the rest of my days without it. I am asking you, Eleanor Hart, to become my wife, not the Duchess of some grand and distant house, though that title will come with it whether either of us finds it convenient, but simply the woman who continues to remind me, every day for the rest of my life, what it means to be valued for the man I actually am." Eleanor stood very still for a long moment, the papers still clutched in one hand, his fingers warm around the other, and felt the whole weight of the past weeks. The fear and the grief and the careful, hard-won trust settle finally into something that felt, for the first time in 3 long years, entirely and unshakably like hope. "Yes," she said, and the word came out simple and certain, without a trace of the caution that had guarded her heart so carefully since Henry's death. "Yes, Edmund, Duke of Weyburn, I will." The town of Millbrook, gathered at its respectful distance, broke into a startled, delighted murmur that rose quickly into cheerful noise, and Margaret Fenwick, Eleanor would learn later, wasted no time at all in ensuring that every soul in town knew, by nightfall, that the printer's widow, who had once pulled a drowned stranger from the river, had agreed to become a duchess before the week was out. Eleanor Hart, who had spent 3 years believing herself alone in the world, with only a struggling shop and a dead husband's debts for company, stood in the lane outside her press, with her hand held fast in a duke's, and understood, at last, that the river which had once seemed to offer her nothing but one more burden to carry alone, had instead delivered to her the one thing she had stopped allowing herself to hope for. A partner who had seen her plainly, without title or fortune to soften the view, and had chosen her anyway, exactly as she was, just as she had chosen him, that cold night by the water, before either of them had any notion of who the other truly was, or what their 2 lives, joined together, might yet become.